Welcome, dear friends, from Alan and myself to the 10th module of Waldorf Direct. Our topic this time is curriculum creation. And there will be 3 of us presenting. It will be me today, and then Alan tomorrow, and Simon Gilman on Wednesday. And we have chosen 3 topics to illustrate what we mean by curriculum creation. And those 3 topics were chosen from a particular perspective. In a sense, the Waldorf curriculum is a living document. That means that we are creating all the time in all of our subjects, although we may be teaching something that is familiar to ourselves from before, but curriculum is more than content, and we will be coming to that in a little while. So we could have chosen anything really to illustrate that to you. And the reason we've come to these 3 subjects is the following. Let's start with Simon Gilman's presentation on outdoor work and gardening on Wednesday. This is something that, as far as I know, Rudolf Steiner never really spoke about in the fundamental education lectures. Things like bushcraft or gardening lessons and so on. And yet they have been part of the Waldorf curriculum from the inception. So lessons in this kind of thing, though Steiner called it practical work, were already there in the afternoons of the first Waldorf school. And they were developed without direct input from him by pioneering teachers and continued and developed in this kind of way. So we have a lot of secondary curriculum on that topic of gardening and outdoor work. Tomorrow's topic, ecology, is something that you could argue should penetrate and pervade every subject we teach, because it is about the healthy relationship between ourselves and our environment. There are some people who speak even of soul ecology. Martin Rawson some time ago talked about the need to come from an ego-logical relationship to the world to an eco-logical relationship to the world, and that we as educators would have to play a part in that. So here is a breadth rather than a depth that is needed in terms of the creation. And the topic I've chosen to speak about today, geography, is maybe one of the oldest school subjects there is. So how do I learn systematically and structurally about my relationship to my environment? That surely must have been there right from the beginning of structured education altogether. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we can surf on the waves that other people generated for us. It doesn't take away the need for looking at why we're teaching, what we're teaching. So here is an established subject in need of constant reinvention. And we hope that with these 3 windows that we give you into the teacher as a curriculum creator, we will encourage you, empower you, enable you to transfer those concepts and skills into whichever realm you are working in. So let me begin by sharing my screen with you. It mentions in that little title the word curriculum. And today, a few of the things I'm going to say to you will be repetitions of things that you've heard before in previous modules, such as my following statement that curriculum is not the same as content. Curriculum is everything that works educationally upon the child. So everything that I want to do with the child in order to educate them could be described as curriculum. But I could include in that also the color on the walls, or my pedagogical interventions, or the kind of food that is served, or the way that we eat that food together in the classroom. All those things are curriculum because they educate the child between them. So, in other words, the curriculum is also maybe the learning environment that we provide. And so the first Waldorf curriculum, the first content list that Rudolf Steiner structurally and deliberately provided, took up a day, 3 lectures on the last day of the first teacher's course. He gave the first, the second, and the third curriculum lecture, and then he set the teachers off. And that was literally only minutes after he told them which classes they would teach. So they'd gone through 3 weeks of intensive work on anthropological foundations, on methods of teaching, on seminars to try out their skills. And then of the 24 participants, 12 were chosen to teach particular classes. And then Steiner told them what to teach. Not so much anymore how to teach it, but you will find that in the first teacher's course in the final pages. And immediately, within a few months, this already became superseded. Practice overtook theory, you could say, or replaced theory to some extent. So some of Steiner's original indications were maintained almost to the day. Others were dropped almost immediately and replaced by something else. And within a few years, somebody came to Rudolf Steiner. Her name was Caroline von Heidebrand. And she said to him, "Can I write this down? Should I write this down? The kind of things that we've agreed to do together, because we have new people joining our school who weren't trained by you, who didn't learn what you taught us. And they are asking us what to teach, and there needs to be something that is a little bit reliable." So he encouraged her to do that, and she did. And we know that as the first of the books on this, Caroline Heidebrand's Waldorf curriculum. It's quite a thin little book. I've got the German edition there at the top left. And then Steiner died. And Karl Stockmeier, who was one of the senior teachers, replaced him as official school director. And in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Stockmeier was nominally responsible for the things that happened in that first Waldorf school. And so he saw it as part of his task to spread himself a little further and bring together more academically, you could say, more accountably, the various places in which Steiner spoke about specific subjects and how to teach them. And that collation then became the next stage, if you like, of the Waldorf curriculum. And that lasted for decades, well into the 1970s and 80s. People who learned about Steiner Waldorf education referred to either the Heidebrand or the Stockmeier version of this. And there were, of course, translations into English and other languages. And then in the 1980s, Tobias Richter, who is an Austrian practitioner, undertook to take all of that and the massively expanded delivery and a huge, what at the time was counted as a huge book, was published. I think 500 or 600 pages that outlined everything in German that Waldorf schools were trying to do. My hard copy of that is currently this one that you see there. The German one has 700 pages. The modern online PDF version of the German Waldorf school curriculum has 1,100 pages. It's huge. It's massive. It's not even being printed anymore for that reason. But because it's a living document, it continues to grow. And then about 25 years ago, Martin Rawson took Tobias Richter's work and collaborated with him on creating a version for British Waldorf schools. This was supposed to be a document that shows in accessible language the practice and theory of Waldorf education in the UK. At the time, there were about 30 plus Waldorf schools in the UK, and the British government was very positively inclined towards Waldorf education and wanted to find out why our pupils are so happy. So Martin and some colleagues at Michael Hall, which was the school where I worked as well at the time, began to formulate this, and they published this in a yellow paperback version. And because it only has about 250 pages, it became a very practical and very accessible document that immediately got reprinted in many countries around the world and translated into lots of other languages. In the English-speaking realm, we now know this as the Yellow Book. And in very accessible and brief version, it shows not only what is being taught and why, and to some extent how, but for the first time, it also gives descriptors of learning objectives, even learning outcomes, as they were called in the language of that time. So you could look up what should children know at the age of 6, 8, 9, 11 in various topics, and use that checklist to prepare your teaching for any year that lies ahead of you. It's a hugely useful thing to do. And it's very properly backed up by what Martin Rawson calls developmental tasks of the children. Language is very important here. Already 25 years ago, Rawson talks about the child having a developmental task. Not the task of the teacher to develop the child. It's the task of the human being to develop themselves with the help of the teacher. And we develop different things at different stages in our lives, different years of our youth. And the teachers recognize that out of an understanding of pedagogical anthropology. So this is how Martin Rawson puts it now, 2023. There's actually just 3 stages involved. We understand the human being and what their needs are. From that, we develop generative working principles that describe to us how we're going to create the Waldorf practice. And the pedagogical practice, what we recognize as curriculum, is developed on that timeline. And having brought it down to this super simple formula, it's no surprise that the latest iteration of Martin Rawson's approach to curriculum only comprises 45 pages. So we've gone up from the very thin booklet of Caroline von Heidebrand that almost only refers to content. We've gone to the 1,100 pages of content, tasks, and didactics and everything. And we've come right back down to the place where a modern theorist like Rawson says, it's not so crucial for me to describe what you should be teaching, as long as you understand how to make your selection of content and of style, and if you know where you're coming from. So this is the spirit in which we're approaching geography now. And if you then research back at the beginning and look at what Rudolf Steiner actually said about geography teaching, it comes as little surprise that he is actually surprisingly open about it. I don't very often read Rudolf Steiner to you in these sessions, but I will in this moment because this is important. You will find this in lecture 11, so on the 11th day of methods of teaching, which is contained in this blue book, the first teacher's course. Geography is a very good example of how you can bring many subjects together. There won't be any dogmatic rules telling you teach geography for this or that age. It will be up to you to decide on the basis of what else you're doing when it is time to include geographical aspects. This puts a lot of responsibility on the teacher, but you can't be a teacher without that. Prescriptive lesson plans make it impossible to teach artistically, and that must not happen. Teachers must be the driving and enlivening element in schools. The driving and enlivening element in schools. You could argue that this is an invitation to randomness. If it's all up to me and nobody can tell me what to teach, who's going to stop me? What is going to stop me from just making it up as I go along and only teaching the kind of things I like teaching and I'm good at teaching? Well, this is where teacher education comes in. This is why we do courses like this, because every freedom always comes with attached responsibility. And in this case, the responsibility I have for getting it right is what buys me the freedom to then do it on my own terms, according to those generative principles. So let's plunge into this a little bit. There can't be many people who haven't seen this diagram on the screen, because I use it a lot. And in this case, I just want to remind you that the threefold human being is a combination of personal intentionality and social context. So if you take the word spirit and body in that framework, there is something that I want to achieve, that I seek out to do, that is biographically important for me as a human being. But I need to marry that to the social context within which I find myself on the earth. And the marriage of those two elements, that is my soul life. In other lectures, I've referred to this as my space of agency. This is where I am at home, and this is the place within the sphere within which I can have influence. So you could say that there is a personal perspective on the world, and there is a general perspective that the world already has, without me being part of it. And those two things come together to marry themselves into this perspective of the individual social being. Because, of course, I am both as human. It's the world and myself, and the two of us have to sort of get together. So if I go to the verse with which we begin the day in almost every Waldorf school in the world, from grade 1 to 4, and examine it in this light, the sun with loving light makes bright for me each day. The sun with loving light makes bright for me each day. Very carefully chosen words by Rudolf Steiner. Because, of course, it's like a mantra that the children are saying without a huge amount of consciousness at this age, from the age of 6 to the age of 10, every school day of their lives. So that translates into about 1,000 times during their first 4 years that they say these words. What picture are they painting in their minds with these words? Well, each day the sun is there. That's an objective fact. In fact, if I did die today, the sun would still rise and make the day bright tomorrow. So there is an objectivity there that is clearly beyond my personal control or even participation. At the same time, I say in those lines, makes bright for me each day. Because, of course, I can't experience the sun through your skin and your eyes. And it's almost irrelevant to my personal relationship to the sun whether it also shines for everybody else. It's just the relationship that I have with it is my relationship. And certainly for the very young child, that's a very crucial thing as an experience. And within the human soul, we now have this interactive experience of the loving light. Because there's more here than light and warmth. You could argue objectively that the sun is a source of light and warmth. In fact, direct experience would make it very difficult to argue against that, which is why most of us are quite happy to sign up to the fact that the sun is a burning gas ball. But that's not all of the picture. What we're not saying when we describe the sun as such is the effect it has on us. And this may be difficult for those of you for whom there is no seasonal change. So if you live near the equator, you may have a very continuous experience of the sun. So you may just have to take my word for it if you've never experienced this before. But it's now the middle of February in the United Kingdom. And we've just come out of a very rainy and fairly cold winter. And there will be a day, probably within the next 2 weeks, when I will be sitting on the bench outside my house. And it will be a sunny day. And I'll be sitting on that bench with my eyes closed, and I will feel the sun softly caressing my skin. And it's almost as if a loved person strokes my skin and makes me feel good. The sun isn't yet hot enough to cause my skin damage. It's not intensive enough for that, but it holds a promise. And it really feels, maybe those of you who live in the Northern Hemisphere like I do can relate to that. It really feels personal. That first day of promise of future warmth. And this is an experience that in this verse, we give to the children 1,000 times in their first 4 school years. That's geography teaching too. Look at the way the world relates to you. Yeah. Look at how happy we are. And very few of us are free of that. Especially those of us who are not near the equator, waking up in the morning, looking out of the window and seeing blue sky and golden sunlight provokes a different soul reaction to seeing an overcast sky and driving rain. And this is relevant. Not a physical fact in that sense, but it of course makes a huge difference in that sphere in the middle that I just called the sphere of agency, where I am at home in me. And if I now relate that to the developmental task of the child, of course, the first 7 years could be described as a time for arriving in the world. So early years, teachers and parents will try to make the children feel that they've made the right decision in incarnating. The phrase that Steiner is often quoted as relating to this age group is, "The world is good." So the overarching ideal of the first 7 years, the world is good. In modern language, we might say, everything makes sense. Everything is as it should be. And so when I take young children into the world, I don't want them to experience environmental destruction and climate change yet. That will come later. What's really important for them is that they feel carried and awed and surprised and delighted, rewarded and nourished. So these 2 children on that picture who are touching both with their hands and with their eyes a mossy tree stump, they're having an incredibly educational sensory experience right now. Yeah, any of you that have touched damp moss first thing in the morning will know what I'm talking about. This is geography teaching in the first 7-year period. And it comes together, because we can't always be outside touching moss, in theoretical displays. So forgive me for this very Eurocentric 4-seasonal collection. Of course, in places where you don't have 4 seasons, that would look quite different. But this is how it would be familiar for me. When I celebrate with the children our awareness, our shared awareness of the rhythms that the earth is going through and that the weather is going through, and how we relate to that. One thing you will see on each of these pictures, and it's an important aspect, is the human being. So when you do your nature table displays, don't forget to insole those displays. Don't just put shells and stones and twigs and grasses and moss, but put a little being that enjoys those. Because that's really the message we're trying to get across. to children at this time, the sun with loving light makes bright for me each day. The rain with sparkling freshness makes wet for me each day, and so on. Yeah, this personal relationship of myself and the world. And in those first few years of school, we not only teach the children that we live as part of nature, but also that we are agents of change. So culture requires us to build things, to transform things, to metamorphose, and to grow. So those activities of the first 3 years, that's also geography teaching, but it's geography teaching with our hands. Not so much with our geography learning, with our hands, not so much with our minds, what's happening here. So by the time this very strongly evocative identity crisis comes in the 10th year of the child's life, they've had a thorough grounding in feeling at home in the world and also beginning to realize in practical ways their own role in that relationship. And then we come to this place where we realize, okay, I've arrived. I'm here now. Now, what am I going to do about that? I know I am here. Logical next question. Why am I here? Why in India? Why not in China or in South Africa or in Canada instead? What is it about me and this place? And anyway, what is this place? Maybe that's the question that needs to be asked first. Before I can know the reason for my being here, maybe I need to find out a little bit more what that here actually comprises. And by that, I mean the environment which is experienceable to me. I traveled a bit in India last autumn, and I suspect that a 10-year-old child in Coimbatore doesn't really understand India yet. They understand Coimbatore, and they might understand a little bit Tamil Nadu, and they might have traveled to Mumbai or Delhi, but it's too big at the moment for them to have a real sense of what India is. So let's begin with what's experienceable. And this is something that's been there really right from the start of World of Education. That block, or there's 2 blocks in grade 4, which are called local geography or local history. So my immediate surrounding and my part in that, the part in that I play. And this is where I'm going to stop talking for a bit, because I would like you to do some work. I'm going to give you a few minutes of silence so you can concentrate on that work. And please feel free, unless you're busy writing down notes, to continue that work as we speak afterwards, because to finish it will probably take you an hour or 2. Or if it disrupts your concentration too much, you just finish it later on. But you may not have done this for a long time, if ever. Picture yourself where you're sitting right now, and then rise up out of your body to the ceiling, and then present that the ceiling isn't there, and keep rising, maybe to about 5 meters above your house. And imagine there is no roof above your room, no further floors. What do you see when you look down on yourself? Obviously, there's you sitting at a desk, on a chair, on a sofa. There's whatever it is that you're leaning your hands on right now. There are other chairs and other bits of furniture in your room. And in the room next door, there may be a bed, there may be a table, a kitchen, there may be other people. What about the flat next door? What about immediately outside your house? On which side are there memorable or identifiable trees? Where is the nearest path, the nearest road, the nearest watercourse? So it's kind of a little bit up to you to how ambitious you want to be with this. At the very least, try and draw yourself from above within your house or flat. So your room and the rooms immediately surrounding you. But then you can rise beyond those 5 meters. If you dare, go 20 meters above your house and imagine what you can see from there. I think I've said enough. Get started on this one. I'll give you 5 or 6 minutes of concentration without my voice, where you can have a go. And then maybe afterwards, we can just briefly share this as work in progress by holding it up to the camera. I'm just going to take my spotlight away and also pause the recording. I will stop the share. And so I am back. And I'm going to give you the opportunity, if you'd like, to just hold up your work in progress to the camera. And those of you, oh yes, very nice. Feel free to just stick your nose close to the screen to have a bit of a look what people are doing. What I'm mostly interested in, of course, is how ambitious have you been? So what scale did you choose when I gave you the choice to choose the scale? Thank you. Thank you for that. So I'll bring the spotlight back. Oh, I'm sorry. Put the spot back. There we go. So please feel free to continue with this. This is obviously work that I asked the pupils to do at this age. And some of you might have already guessed as to my intention for doing that. So allow me to share my screen with you again. It's one of the tasks that I choose to give the children because of the learning objectives I've placed there when I started creating the curriculum for this block. That delightful boy I showed you just now with the 3 questions, he has a developmental task. And the task is to step out of his parents' and teachers' responsibility, which so far has been to make him feel at home here, and now to find a way to feel at home on the earth on his own terms. That's his job as a 10-year-old child. And that job is the same everywhere in the world. Martin Rosen refers to this as the macro element of curriculum creation. Yeah. So it's in a way, that's the big picture. All 10-year-olds in the world, or 9 to 11-year-olds in the world, go through a phase where they have to stop letting their parents carry full responsibility, or their teachers, and say, actually, how do I feel here? And can I make a difference to that in some form or other? It's the beginnings of this. The meso aspect is then, how do I marry that to where I actually am? Some of you will have found it quite difficult to imagine rising out of themselves because you've got another 17 stories of people living above you. Others might have found it quite easy because you're in a very small two-room house in the middle of a big garden. And that's a reality that, of course, makes a huge difference to who you are and how you feel about who you are. Whether you're very exposed to the natural environment or very divorced from it in your living situation. And the same is true for you as a school, of course. If you try to really explore your surrounding, then whether you're in a big school with 500 people and a large ground, it's a different situation from if you're in a very small school in the middle of a city on the 3rd floor of a multi-story building. So the cultural aspect of being where you are really quite important here. And finally, what matters in creating that experience for the children in your class is, who is each child and who are you? So what are they really interested in? What is each child really interested in terms of finding out about Devon or Turin or Konkan or Beijing? And what do you bring as a teacher to this? I've sometimes in lectures referred to my colleague at my very first school who followed me as a class teacher. She was the year below me. And she had, before she became a Waldorf teacher, she had studied cartography. That was her learned profession. So obviously, in all her geography teaching, this was something which she brought as her particular skill, and her class became amazing in drawing maps. Now, that doesn't mean that every teacher in our school had to do it this way, but this was her approach. The teacher above me was also the music teacher in the school. And so when she did geography lessons all the way through the middle school, she looked at different cultures and what songs they sang. And so this is the micro level at which you really have the greatest possible amount of freedom, where you say yes to who you are and you say yes to who each individual child is. And one of the absolutely crucial elements I find in here is that golden triangle in the middle for each child. Think about the child's perspective. Finding my place in the world is actually not that big because there's a lot of world. And there's me, and there's the place where I live, and there's the history that has made the place what it is. And somehow the three of us have to come together. And that's this golden place in the center. And if I can hit that with an activity that I give to the child, then they will have maximum motivation for their work. And one such activity is what I would call the home project. I don't expect you to read all this now off the screen, but as usual, screens with a lot of writing, you will be able to access that later on from those slides in the folder. If you're really impatient, you can always take a screenshot of this now. But much more important than the child learning the history of my town or my school building is that they learn the history of the building in which they live, in which they spend most of their day, their house, their home, their flat, and who lived there before them, and why is it the shape it is, and what about that whole part of town, the road in which they live, the neighbors with which they share their lives. And the more they find out about this, the more agency they develop. Their soul life increases massively through this project, because they might never have asked their parents before, why did you actually move here? And the answer to that is hugely significant in terms of finding out who they are. So the learning objective of arriving consciously is beautifully served by having a project like this. And as you can see, this requires no teaching at all from me as a teacher. Each child will be doing this work according to the curriculum, which, as I said in my opening statement, actually is also the learning environment. I set a very specific project. I create the environment in which now the child goes about their developmental task with my accompaniment, but not under my direction. That's the 10-year-old child now. Good. We're moving on. If we take a moment to step back from the practical application and look at what geography is actually for, we find quite quickly why Rudolf Steiner describes it as the mother of all subjects. There are very few things we teach children that don't have something of a geographical element. And Phil Wright, who is or was a high school geography specialist at the South Devon Steiner School in the UK, went to the trouble of writing down, formulating what the human being learns through studying geography. So these are through doing things. We'll come back later to another more complicated slide. And like with the last one, I don't want to spend time on it, but have a look at this later on when you go through the content of this module and ask yourself, I wonder what if I could formulate something similarly for number work or for artistic work or for movement. What are the skills that I learn because of it? Not in order to understand it, but what skills is geography, is eurythmy, is numeracy teaching me that I can then transfer onto other things? And this is what I'm very grateful to Phil for this particular work. Because these 3 I's are probably what should inform our curriculum creation at all times. You could call this, again, the macro level to some extent. I have an intention for the child. They should have a particular experience. That's my learning objective. I then bring a lot of imagination into how to implement that in the classroom. And then I also need to find out how it's actually landing with the child. And it's always going to be like that the thing that tells me most about the child is the thing with which I am least involved as a teacher. So I'll give you an example. Many Waldorf teachers have made a habit of creating beautiful blackboard drawings. Let's say, for example, you're doing a local geography project and you're making your school building an essential feature in that. So you might have gone to a lot of trouble of drawing your school on the blackboard, taken a whole Saturday to do that maybe. And then on the Monday, the children come in and you tell them stories about their school and they copy your drawing. And then on the evening of that day, you look at the children's books and you find that more or less they've all got the same drawing in their books. Some of them will have done it very well and some of them not so beautifully. But all you learn from looking at the books is how good they are at drawing. They've not told you anything else about themselves. Now compare that with your assessment of their home project and how deeply they've gone into the history of their building, their street, the character of their neighbors, and so on. You learn so much more from the child if you give them things to do where they decide the depth and the level and the intensity of their engagement. As diagnostic tools, work that is copied from the blackboard is pretty useless in this respect. And if we really want to serve the intentionality of the child in making themselves at home here, then we need to give them more opportunities to show themselves to us so that we can make the right curriculum for them. And that's why this last I, the impact, requires a force from us that Rudolf Steiner describes as intuition. I'm not, when I say impact measurement or assessment, I don't mean tests necessarily. It can be a small part of this, but I actually mean observation that is based on seeing not just with the eyes and the mind, but also seeing with the heart. And especially if I'm measuring engagement rather than achievement of a child, I need to cultivate my intuitive forces as a teacher so that what translates itself to me has an impact in the judgment that I form. You realize I'm struggling a little bit with putting it into precise words, but that's just demonstrating that there is an element beyond words. And those of you who are experienced teachers know that. You will recognize that lives in every relationship that I have with individual children and with my class as a whole. And I don't serve it well by calling it a name, but it does inform everything that I plan. This intuitive relationship of what is the healthy thing to do and to say right now. And that is to do with the impact that my education has on the child. So here's the other slide I promised you, where Phil Wright goes from the left side, that's what I showed you earlier, the doing of geography, to the thinking skills that geography also enables us to develop. And all of those are transferable again. So coherent thinking, creative thinking, rational thinking, and so on are all trained, exercised by the topic of geography, and this can be part of my learning objective formulation. Yeah. So independent of whether I'm in grade 4 or grade 8, I can bring something and I want to exercise their creative thinking. So that's how I then create my delivery, so that they have that. And you realize we're quite close with this kind of thinking to where Steiner wanted us to be. In that quote I gave you at the beginning, where he said, I'm not going to tell you what to do when. You'll know what to do when, but you need to do the work first. And then things will fall into place. So you will find that as we go through now some practical examples, that it kind of works like this. Now, if you were in the UK and it was 10 years ago, and I asked you, give me 2 lines on geography teaching in a Waldorf school, you would be quite likely to say the following. Class 4, local geography. Class 5, the British Isles. Class 6, the continent of Europe. Class 7, another continent. Class 8, the peoples of the world. Each year was given a very neat, tidy title. And what we have here is the verbal equivalent of dropping a pond into a water and then watching concentric rings appear. We start at the smallest ring and we watch those rings get wider and wider. And in that same lecture, in the first teacher's course, Steiner rather shockingly calls that a pedantic approach. We can expand this picture. He's talking about the local awareness. If we have done this step in the right way, we don't need to do this pedantically. A pedantic teacher would say that the most natural approach was to describe the geography of the children's immediate surroundings first. That's what we just did. And then widen this out concentrically. But that is not necessary. Once you have prepared the foundations so that the children understand the connection between nature and the way people live, you can go on to something else. The connection between nature and the way people live. That's class 4. That's the foundations of the thing that's actually called geography. But that is running certain dangers. The first of those is what in modern academia is called environmental determinism. So the relationship between nature and the way people live. And when I was a very young teacher, one of my favorite books was by one of the first Waldorf teachers. His name was Herbert Hahn, and I admire him hugely. And the book is called Of the Genius of Europe. And in that book, he rather lovingly describes different European peoples, the French and the English and the Germans and the Italians. And he says, and this is what they are like. And he constantly links the description of those people to the place where they live. So for instance, he describes Swiss people as follows. He says there's basically 2 types of Swiss people. There's those people who are completely open to the world and keen to invite the world in and engage with the world. And then there's those people who don't want to see any of the world and who are quite parochial and closed off. And he says, and that's because they live in the mountains. Because depending on where you are on the mountain, you either see a lot of the world or you see nothing at all because you're right at the bottom of the valley. And the inference that we could get to from that image was that if you live in Switzerland and if you live in a mountainous area, your horizon is going to be limited. You're going to be a bit dull or a bit limited in terms of your flexibility. And that's an awful thing to assume of somebody, especially in a world where we move and we move and we move, and so that's called environmental determinism. Yeah. your mind is wide open because you live in Essex in Eastern England and there are no mountains anywhere, for example. Yeah. It's not appropriate, and we need to guard against that. There was a time when that was fashionable, but that time is long gone. Okay. The next thing is traditional simplifications. So again, when I say Japanese people are all very clean, that may be a compliment towards Japanese people, but it's based on a super simplification. Yes, there may be some superficial layer of Japanese culture that looks at, for example, a certain type of Japanese toilet, or at the fact that Japanese people wash before they have a bath. But again, you realize that I didn't just use the word some Japanese people or many. And that qualifier is important here. I've seen too many simplifications in Waldorf books where the teacher talked quite blithely and not insultingly at all about a certain group of people. And the children just wrote that into their books. And then they take that picture with them. Dutch people ride bikes, for example, is one of those traditional simplifications. And it's probably true that there are more bikes per head of population than in other countries. In fact, there are more bikes in Holland than there are people. That's a well-known fact. And yet it's not true for every Dutch person. Okay. Outdated concepts relate to things that might have been true in the 1960s, but are no longer true. Okay. And you've heard me say this before, this is the problem with using outdated but well-meant resource material, such as the work of Charles Kovacs, the much admired Scottish Hungarian Waldorf teacher, whose work was translated into books that are accessible on history and on geography and so on. He described the world as he knew it, but he wasn't very widely traveled. So he himself read books that were themselves quite old-fashioned and outdated already in the mid-20th century. And then he wrote about people and places. And some of those things simply aren't true anymore, even if they were true then. So we have to be very careful about this. Yeah. There might have been a time when you could see lots of French people with a baguette stuck under their arm at a certain time in the morning. If I go through Paris now, I don't see anyone who carries a baguette under their arm. Yeah. So we need to let go of those old-fashioned ideas about people because they're not helping. And finally, and maybe I don't have to really spend much time on that at all, the question of racial stereotyping. The concept of race is one that is fast disappearing from culture. So there is currently an interesting conversation going on within the German political system, because the German constitution promises equal treatment to people regardless of their gender, their beliefs, and various other descriptors, including race. And there are 2 German states that have removed the word race from that list because they've said race itself is an outdated concept. And interestingly, the backlash against that has come from some people who were and have been disadvantaged because of their ethnicity, and say, until we have an equitable world, that sentence and that word must remain there. As long as there are racists, we have to keep referring to race. It's only when we got rid of the racists that we can strike that word from our consciousness. So you can see there, it's difficult here, but should I share this? Yes, I think I will share this with you. In the first school where I worked, I once had to mentor a colleague who was quite an experienced Waldorf teacher. And in their class 7 geography book, I found the sentence that said something like, people who live near the equator are darker because the sun is burning hotter there. And the children had written that into their books. And I'm very uncomfortable with stuff like that. Yeah, there was also reference to the physical size. Why Scandinavians are taller, for example, than people in the Congo, which isn't even true. And one has to be very careful about this and best try to avoid that kind of stereotyping. So when I talk about synergy between people and nature, I'm not talking about determination. None of us need to be determined by the place in which we live. So in order not to be pedantic, I propose that rather than say in grade 5, we do India, or we do Japan, or we do Britain, that we tell the story of a river from its source to the sea. And along that story, we develop geography concepts that illustrate the synergy between the human being and nature. And we explain to the children how nature works. So what you see here is the source of the Rhine, that famous Central European river. And there are some questions that we can ask the children straight away when we show them this, which is, why is there a source at all? The idea that rivers come from mountains is relatively easily accessible, but how does the water get into the mountains in the first place? And why? We all know that it runs downhill, but who brought it uphill to start with? And so we begin to have that first concept, for example, the rain cycle, that we can introduce to the children at this point, the water cycle, and also how the water finds its way down the mountain. In fact, one of the most fun experiments that I did with a grade 5 was to model a great big mountain out of clay into a basin, and then to hang up a water bottle with no bottom, upside down, and with holes poked into the lid, and to make that rain onto the clay mountain for about a week. So every time the water bottle got empty, we refilled it again at the top when we thought about it. And of course, what happened was that there was an indentation was made at the top. And at some time, the water then overflowed and it found its own way down the mountain. So it created a river path. And at the bottom, it created a beach in that, around that mountain, because it was carrying that mud down with it. And we had a very practical long-term demonstration of how erosion works. So the Rhine then flows out of the mountains into a great big, very deep lake. Of the kind I suspect you also have in the south of the Himalayas. That lake is 260 meters deep because it wasn't just shaped by water running. It was shaped by glaciers carving. And here we have the possibility to explain the concept of that, including the concept of the Ice Age. So that there was a time when this landscape was not created, but metamorphosed substantially by gigantic ice rivers that were hugely heavy, that were moving, and that were pushing underneath them sandpaper on a gigantic scale, if you like. Yeah, that was carving out these big, big valleys. But we also have the present day reality of this lake, that 4 million people are reliant on its water for drinking in Germany and in Switzerland and in Austria. Yeah? So this is a gigantic natural reservoir of excellent quality drinking water. And if you live there using the meso level, for example, or somewhere near it, you can then go and visit the place where that water comes out of the lake and see how it's processed. So my school was just in the bottom right corner here, where my cursor is right now. And of course, that was something we spent quite a bit of time on because this was our experienceable reality. I won't take you through the whole journey because I think you can see where this is going now. But just maybe one more example, and that is by the time it gets to Basel. So the 3 countries meet, Germany, France, and Switzerland. There's this big city called Basel, and the Rhine makes a bend and goes from a west-east direction to a south-north direction. And at this point, there is the closest place where the Rhine is to the Rhone, which is a French river that is connected to the Mediterranean Sea. And already several hundred years ago, people dug a canal that links the Rhine and the Rhone, which means that through the Rhine and the Rhone, you can go from the North Sea to the Mediterranean Sea by ship. And at the point where those meet, where the canal meets the Rhine, this city grew up called Basel. And it has a gigantic chemical industry because a lot of the materials that are needed for it in great quantities are transported by boat. And so this is a great place to be. Plus, chemical industry needs a lot of coolant, needs a lot of water, and so on. So what you realize now is we're talking synergy all the time. Basel is there because of the river, but people dug the canal in the first place to link those two rivers, which made Basel a more attractive place for industry to be. And so changed the natural landscape, putting an artificial river there, a canal, and also substantially influenced what lives in the river. The river is, of course, a living being. In 1980, there was a leak of poison from one of those chemical factories, and it killed all the fish in the River Rhine for about 2 years. It was that powerful, and substantial environmental legislation was the consequence of that. Nowadays, you can swim in the River Rhine almost everywhere because it's so much, much cleaner than it was in the 1970s and 80s. It's because people almost killed it. And those kind of things can be shared with children. And as I said, I won't do everything now, but look at this list. That's just 3 weeks in grade 5. And you have all this content that you bring to them as a continuous narrative of the life story of a river. And of course, you've actually covered Germany from the south to the north, but you've taken in Switzerland and France and Holland at the same time. And you've shown the children that the natural waterway is actually very important from a cultural civilizatory point of view. So this could be a really useful way of extending that local consciousness from grade 4 into grade 5 without just sticking to your partly artificial borders that determine whether your land is Thailand or Laos or Myanmar or whatever. So try and think a little bit more flexible, and I think your children will benefit from that. So when you're now thinking about, well, what should I then teach the children about my country, Holland or Thailand or the United States? First question is, what are the learning objectives? What do I want the children to learn about my country or their country? Secondly, that's age appropriate as well. So when do I teach them things about this country? And then you can make a little list like I have done here as well. There are geographical facts that children need to learn. There is the history and development of my country. And there is also the present day reality of it. So in case of Britain, for example, I find almost every kind of geography in that wonderfully diverse little island in which I live. So I can tell them about all sorts of things that are purely geographical. It's also had a really interesting history because people came and went all the time. But right now, we are again engaged in a process of changing that. So as you know, a few years ago, Britain or the United Kingdom left the European Union, and this created a new reality in its relationship to the continent of Europe. Now, right now, we have this question over whether we should welcome immigration to this country or not. Those are present day facts that will need to be covered at school. It's up for you to decide at what age they are appropriate, whether that's in grade 5 or in grade 8 or in grade 10. But the list on this page needs to be covered during the school time of the children in your school, because they won't learn this from their parents, I think. Okay. I'm going to give you a little bit of a light relief visually from all that wordness. I want to show you something which I sort of invented. I say sort of because I'm sure somebody else did this before me. And that is to introduce grade 6 geography by looking at the world as a whole. I have a bit of a problem with map abstraction. If I imagine a map of the world, I always see Canada at the top left, and I always see Australia at the bottom right, because that's how I grew up. And if you've grown up with an Asian map of the world, you will have similar kind of determinations. But of course, the Earth isn't flat, and the Earth is a globe. And how can I try and make the children feel that? And my initiative was to actually make them each build a globe for themselves. So in the folder that you will be able to access with the recording of this, I will also have a detailed description on how to do that, because I don't have time to explain it in technical detail now. But this is briefly the process. So you take an inflatable ball, a beach ball as we call it in the UK, and you cover it with papier-mâché and paint it. And then you need to add latitude and longitude lines to it. They need to be at the requisite size. And then as a teacher yourself in preparation, you more or less freehand add the continents to that. And it's very important that you do this by yourself before you do it with the children. Okay. I'm just going to briefly show you mine. In case you've seen lots of lectures of mine, it's always hanging there. So this is the globe I made about 10 years ago before doing it with my children. It's absolutely important that you don't embark on a project like that without having tried it out before. Okay. So what you see on the screen now is 32 children having finished the papier-mâché and letting that dry over the first weekend, and then painting it white on the next day, and then having to be very careful about the latitude and longitude lines. And you can already see the boy on the left is going to have to do a bit of correction there, because he's not measured very carefully, and he's going to get into trouble doing that. So this is a very good education moment where they learn about precision. What you see on the blackboard here are the 4 cardinal points of each continent. So where's the southernmost, the westernmost, the easternmost, the northernmost point of each continent? And the children find that on their thing. And then they actually get some templates that are taken from my thing, where they have to draw around the outlines of that. I don't expect them at this age to draw this freely. But you can see here, they actually need to work in pairs in order to make this happen. And then in the final week, we add some mountains, and we add the color to this. And we end up with really something quite beautiful that the children are quite rightly proud of. This is quite an extraordinary thing that they've made for themselves. And of course, in all this time, while the North Pole is, in our case, at the top, there is no left and right if you have a sphere. Yeah. So if you're looking for Japan, you have to appropriately turn it. You can't just go right. And this is, of course, a much more useful and much more authentic picture of what the globe is actually like. Now, this is a very artisanal project, if you like. So we'll be working with our hands for 3 weeks. In addition to that, I've also given those children some actual factual skills, because we spent a good hour every morning doing that, making that globe. And then once everything is tidied away, we've got about half an hour on other things. And I've decided in my case now that it's important to give them 2 things: knowledge and skill. Knowledge about the different countries in Europe, because they're now 12 years old, and it's important that they know a few things about the continent, which is their home. But also the skill, which is listening to information and note-taking at the same time. So each child is provided with some note paper, and I give them a presentation, because the last hour and a half or hour and 15 minutes, they've been, workshopping with their globes. They're now ready to sit down and listen and do some serious work. So I give them a different presentation every day about one of the countries in Europe, and they listen to me and they write down notes, and their homework then is to translate those notes into a coherent text about that country, so that they remember the salient facts. So the skill here is, the transferable skill is writing what somebody speaks, and then also translating that into a short text that leaves out the unnecessary bits, the less important parts. And again, each child will make that decision. What's important to me and what isn't so important. And I don't think there's anything wrong with making that decision, as long as they all remember things like the capital of the country and so on correctly. And then we come to grade 7 and 8. That's always been a bit of a hazy thing. I remember when I was a young teacher, I was told, well, if you do America in grade 7, then you do Asia in grade 8. And yeah, I can see that there's a certain logic to that. But I would say that to start with, let's look at what needs to have already been covered in order to develop a global consciousness. So in grades 4, 5, and 6, children will need to create the preconditions for now looking in a more abstract, necessarily a more abstract way, at the rest of the world. So what do rivers do to a civilization? Where do we find harbors? What role do mountains play in climatic conditions? What do you grow in certain soils? And what plants and industries will thrive in certain areas? So that kind of thing I've learned, I've developed certain concepts of, and then I can look at this a little bit. And forgive me for the Eurocentric nature of this map, but you could have a similar one now with Asia being at the center. And I don't know if you already know that this is substantially distorted. And class 7 is an important year in which to learn not only what causes this distortion, but also what consequences that has had. So many teachers I know do this in by way of taking a satsuma and drawing a world map with a ball pen on the skin of that satsuma, and then peeling it off so that it remains in one piece, and then cutting it so that you can lay it flat onto the table. And what happens is, when you do that, is that the countries closest to the equator are basically the same shape as they were when it was three-dimensional, but the countries closest to the poles are bigger because you need to stretch the skin in order to make that work flat. And this is why this large white blob at the top here, Greenland, is grotesquely exaggerated in terms of their real size. Yeah. On this map, it's called the Mercator projection, Greenland is the same size as Africa. In reality, Africa is 14 times the size of Greenland. But the fact that these northern countries especially are so exaggerated has played a huge part in their sense of self-importance. Greenland is owned by Denmark. Even on this scale, Denmark is virtually invisible on this map. But imagine, well, if you own this much, then no wonder are you entitled to gain a substantial chunk of the world in this colonial race. This projection is about 140 years old. It's called the Peters projection. It's still not accurate because it's flat, but it has been corrected. So there's a mathematical formula you can apply by recorrecting everything to show its accurate size. And by actual land surface, this is a much more accurate description of the size of Africa, for example, and its relationship to, let's say, Britain. I don't know if you can find Britain on this map. It's not that easy because it's much, much smaller here than it would be on a Mercator map. And Denmark has shrunk even more. So this is work that is important to do with the children. And now we have a number of content concepts that need to be covered with the children. Global consciousness, remember? So how do trade winds work? So in grade 7, of course, when I talk about the voyages of Europeans sailing ships across the globe, there's a reason why they went a certain way. Why Columbus could not have sailed to Canada, for example, from Europe, because it would have been gone against the wind all the time. Why he had to end up in the Caribbean. There's a meteorological, a physical reason for that. So children need to understand that. They need to understand also surface connectors like the Silk Roads. They need to understand how world climate hangs together, how hurricanes are caused and what impacts they have, how the world economy works, how weather works. And this traditional title, The Earth and Its Peoples, I think one could argue that one could lose the S at the end. Because identifying peoples is, of course, putting up a boundary between one people and another. And we know where that leads. And it's not always necessary to do that. Yeah, it's not absolutely necessary. You might disagree with this, of course, but I think we're in a state of flux where these definitions are concerned. And that's also part of being a curriculum creator, is to have one's finger on the pulse of this. This next slide, I don't want to talk about it in any kind of detail. It's just there as a reminder. You will recall that in module 6 of this course, when we talked about assessment, we looked at various structural ways of measuring the impact of our work. Please make that part of your planning, because you've created learning objectives. The whole idea of curriculum creation is to do with deciding what the children should be learning from this. Almost at the same time, you need to create a structure around which you can test that. At which you can assess the impact that you're having. And what form that should take. It's not enough to leave that to luck or to, I think I'll do a test today. I think it would be good to learn and practice ways in which to assess against those learning objectives. So it's your turn again. I'm going to divide you into breakout rooms in a moment. And there will be 5 breakout rooms. And each of the rooms will have a different continent. And what I would like you to do is to have a brief conversation about what learning objectives should be for children in your country, in your city, in your school, in your classroom. What are the learning objectives for learning about this continent? So let's say you've decided to spend 3 weeks on Africa or on North America or South America or Europe or Asia as not the continent where you are. What's important to you that the children should learn at the age of 13 or 14? So I'm going to create some breakout rooms, and I'm going to let you choose which one you go to. So there are 5 rooms. Room 1 is Africa, 2 is North America, 3 is South America, 4 is Europe, and 5 is Asia. You'll get an invitation in a minute, and you can choose where you want to go. And try to remember in your conversation the 3 levels. For this age group, what's the developmental task? For my context, what should be the learning objective? So, for example, if let's say you're in Britain and you look at Asia. you're going to have a different relationship because of the colonial past than if you're in South America and you look at Asia. Yeah? There are different things you have to consider there. And finally, how important is the macro level? What are your children most likely to be interested in, and what can you bring to the table as an individual? So I think you'll be quite mixed in terms of what your background is, which is nice. So we can also learn from each other. How do people in Thailand see this differently from people in India and so on? Okay, here we go. Feel free to choose. And I'll see you in 10 or 15 minutes.
Can you repeat, Sven, which room is which continent?
Okay. 1 is Africa. 2 is North America. 3 is South America. 4 is Europe. And 5 is Asia. I'm also going to send a message to all the rooms in a minute, where I repeat that.
Sven, just one more question.
Yes, please.
And are we choosing continents other than our own?
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
Right.
The idea is that you choose a continent where you're not living. Yes.
Yeah, I don't think that's the case right now.
Okay. Are you already in room 5? Okay.
No, I'm not, but I can see the names tumbling into the room, so I can make out. Yeah.
Okay. I'll broadcast that again.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I'll broadcast into the rooms now as well. So welcome back. I hope you could make a bit of a start that might have been helpful for you to consider where you might go next with your class. Maybe you also shared in your breakout room a slight sense of fear that you don't have somebody telling you exactly what to teach and when to teach it. There is an element, isn't there, in all of us, which would quite like it to be given something. And so that statement that Steiner makes there at the very beginning, I don't think it's there for us to feel comfortable. It's relatively easy for somebody in my position who's taught that age group quite a few times, and has some experience to go with. But if it's your first time coming to this, don't you deserve a little bit more than that? And that's an understandable perspective, of course. However, the questions you ask in terms of what should I teach and when are most naturally asked of those people who've taught before you. So the class teachers above you, for example. And it might be quite useful while you ask that question, or even before you ask that question, to consider who they asked. Because if we're not careful, then this way of informing our input could lead to another shallower curve of penetration of why we do things. And it doesn't serve the children in the way that it should serve the children, I think. Let me just bring back the screen share. There's something I haven't yet mentioned, which I think is, in my experience, one of the most wonderfully rewarding elements for teachers and children, and that is your enthusiasm. Yes, it's hard work to read lots of books, to troll lots of pages on the internet, to find out about the Maasai in Kenya and how they live and all that kind of thing. But when you've made yourself an expert on these things, and you can bring a really passionate, interesting presentation to the children that gets them riled up and excited, and they want to find out more, then teaching is just the best job in the world. And this enthusiasm that you self-create, the imagination that comes to you as a gift, as a result of that work that you've put in, that's irreplaceable. And I'd rather have 13 facts that I'm sure of and very excited about than 26 facts that I've read in a book and I'm reciting down for the children. So quality beats quantity every time, I would say, in this. And I'll quote Rudolf Steiner once more, although not verbatim. In lecture 14 of Anthropological Foundations, the first teacher's course, so one day before the end of the course, he clearly feels there's something he hasn't said quite enough. And he talks about the need for the quality of imagination in the middle school. He says that sometimes it's quite understandable and even forgivable to be a bit boring as a teacher, especially when the children are little. When you're teaching them to read and write, Steiner says, it's forgivable to not be absolutely amazing all the time because it's a bit of a boring subject, reading and writing and numbers and so on. But he says, don't you dare be boring when it comes to middle school and science and geography and history and philosophy. That's when you have to fire the children's imagination through your own. And he uses the word imagination 27 times in 3 pages. That's how strongly he feels about it. Yeah. So this is the age when we really want to light fires, I find. And we can do that so much better when we feel a passionate connection to what we teach. So let's say you have opened the yellow book because you're a bit, I do that every time as well. It's not something just for beginners. Yeah. You open the yellow book and you have a look at what does Martin Rawson suggest. So this is a little bit out of date. One of it from the first edition. And it's me following up. What should I teach my pupils about meteorology in grade 8? And there's a list. Meteorological readings, rainfall, humidity, air pressure, wind speed. Making instruments, high and low pressure, northern countries, Mediterranean lifestyle, desert peoples, Arctic peoples. I can see this is a bit old-fashioned. Tropical environments. So he gives me a list of content. Now, I can take this and think, okay, what can I relate to here? What meets my learning objectives? Remember that list I showed you earlier on. So getting the children an idea about climatic conditions and how they influence each other. El Nino, for example, or ocean currents, that kind of thing. If I haven't done that yet, now is the time. Low pressure and high pressure, very important to understand from my personal well-being point of view. If, low pressure comes together when the time that I get my period, and I get a headache from that, then that's quite a good thing to understand what low pressure actually is. And that we all walk around with a 10-meter column of air on our head. Yeah, that 10-kilometer, column of air on our head. And that weighs something. And that column gets lighter if we go higher up. That has consequences for us. So those kind of concepts, yes, I get that. So examine each one of those lists that you get from Martin Rawson, from Stockmeyer, from the next door teacher, and apply it to your concrete situation. How does it serve the macro level, meso level? Does it inspire me on a micro level? And then you can look at objective things that are there for the children. Out there, they can observe cumulus clouds and cirrus clouds and learn the difference between them. If you remember that diagram I showed you earlier with the sun with loving light, yeah, This is the bottom part of that diagram. Yeah, that's objectively there, those clouds. But don't forget, we're still teaching through feeling. We're not in the high school yet. So with those clouds, it's not just important to be able to identify and classify them. We also need to know how it feels when weather happens. This is one of my favorite paintings because it's a point of departure and it shows the process of lifelong learning of a famous English painter. Usually when I show this to my English students and I ask them identify the painter, they say, that's Turner. Some of you might know enough about romantic paintings to see that that's the style. Yeah, but it's not. It's John Constable, who was Turner's great compatriot and is much more famous for painting photorealistic depictions of pastoral and urban scenes where nothing moves. Everything is as if frozen in time. And what has Constable done here, inspired by Turner, I think, he's not painted rain over the sea the way it actually looks. He's painted it the way it feels. And that's important. Because when I'm standing on the beach and I'm on a hike and I'm looking up into the sky to identify the clouds, I'm not doing that as a scientist, am I? I'm doing that as a day tripper. And I don't want to get drenched. And I'm frightened of maybe the wind that's going to come and drench me in a minute with those clouds. So I have a personal relationship. And that personal relationship to meteorology is just as important as the personal relationship to fables and Old Testament stories and whatever else I would be bringing. So never lose sight of the human being element in this. So I teach the children how to write haikus, for example, at this time. And we try and understand how a haiku works, that it's never just descriptive. It also tells a story. And that brings the human element into the observation. So the middle one, for example, soft marshmallow clouds topped with peaks of whipping cream. I dream of sunshine. Describes the weather, but it also has me in the picture. Yeah, there's a narrative here. And these are haikus written by 14-year-old children, yeah, who are going into this kind of weather idea. Of course, don't ignore the science. Yeah. So it's a great thing to build weather vanes and measure rainfall and all these kind of things. Don't forget to remind the children that it's not just about their experience. Just don't ignore that altogether. Because human life is not objective. Human life is always relational. And so I'm segueing slightly towards maybe the area that Alan's going to cover tomorrow. And I'll give Alan in a minute, I'm giving him a moment or two to tell you a little bit about tomorrow's session. But for obvious reasons, the concept of climate change doesn't even enter the curriculum books until the very, very recent editions. So even in books that were published in the early 2000s, you won't find this yet. There isn't anything good recently published or some time ago published by Waldorf people that can tell you what to teach. But if you don't teach it, then who will? And clearly we have a responsibility to the young people in our care, that they understand what's going on. They empathize with it to the extent that they feel they have a role to play. And then they feel empowered to play that role. So that 3-step, I understand what's going on. It matters to me. And this is what I'm going to do about it. That's a key process, psychological process in education that we go through all the time. And so this will be my list. What I've put there is not for you to copy out and then teach to. If I teach it, those are the things on my list. Yeah, they understand climate. They understand the human role in impacting on it. They understand the damage we've already done, what possible solutions there are, and where they can exercise their own agency. That's would be for me. Do I give it 1 week? one lesson a day? Do I spread it out over a term, one lesson a week? Do I do 2 project weeks where we do nothing but this all day long? Nobody can tell me that. I can relate. I can plan this and then, talk to the colleagues in my school. Say, shall we all do this together? Not put it on the curriculum for grade 8, but say we do it now and we do it again in 5 years' time and we do it with the whole school. Age appropriately. Certain things, let's say from class 4 to class 12. We do groups, age cross-curricular, cross-age groups. So each group will have 18-year-olds in and 10-year-olds in, and they work with each other on one aspect of this with a teacher. And we have 5 teachers doing the whole thing in 5 groups. This is where we can get really creative, where there is nothing that tells us this is how to do it. And I love opportunities like this. And I would love it if we did not feel constrained by things like timetables and printed curricula that hold us back from doing what we actually should be doing. Because it's this. Geography has this gesture, but I would say education, even lifelong education, has this gesture. We understand the dynamic that exists between ourselves and our environment in order to feel a resonance here. The world matters to me, and I matter in the world. This modern panacea for mental illness, the feeling of relevance and resonance. Yeah, I have a living, positive, meaningful relationship to the people and the world around me, and as they do to me. If I feel those 2 things to be in balance, I'm much more likely to live a healthy and successful and satisfying life than if that's somehow out of shape. So this would be my aim, and I hope I've shown you a little bit how geography can contribute to playing its part in reaching that aim. That's one of the examples. Alan, I'm going to bring you in at this point with a little bit of a trailer for tomorrow.
Thanks, Sven. That was a perfect segue, to use your word again. I was actually going to start tomorrow. I will start tomorrow by looking at the words you just used. People might want to do their homework in advance. I've been looking up when was the term global warming first used. And of course, we can all assume correctly that it wasn't in common use during Steiner's time. Well, what about ecology? How long has the word ecology been around? And what's the German equivalent? I might ask you to give a word or 2 about the German word Mitwelt, Sven. Yeah, because it's different to environment. So we will look at words and we'll look at the history a little bit, because so many of the issues that we have to work with, and when I say we have to work with, it's a moral compulsion. They're around issues that simply weren't there in this way, in this shape, in this form, with this kind of sense of peril and urgency. It wasn't like that in Steiner's time, although he was acutely aware of the environmental crisis that we were starting to live through, even back in his time. Even organic farming was in crisis. The birth of biodynamic farming came as a response from Steiner when organic farmers said, we cannot carry on in this way. That's a long, long time ago that they were saying that. So we should look at ecology, we should look at global warming, and we should look at the responsibility that places on us. And of course, we can't just lift this all out of existing books. The curriculum really has to be created anew. And to help us do that tomorrow, I would like you to be aware. I'm going to ask you to make a warm, loving relationship with snails. Yes, you heard it correctly. snails, maybe even slugs and snails. So part of our journey tomorrow will be looking at the place of snails in the Steiner Waldorf curriculum. And I don't think that sentence has ever been spoken before. That's probably it. That's probably it, Sven.
Thank you very much, Alan. So from both of us, thank you very much for being here. We've come to a very punctual ending time. So as has become tradition, feel free to unmute yourself and say goodbye to everybody. And in case you're missing somebody here, one of your colleagues who normally comes, it may be because they've forgotten that it's on. So, just drop them a WhatsApp and say, have you remembered to come to Waldorf Direct? Because, of course, we also have Waldorf 360 now running as a course. And for some people, it might be a little bit much. Good. Thank you very much for being here.